You are listening to Spiritual PTSD. I'm Damian Skinner, a recovering exorcist and Christian. The stories you are about to hear are all first-hand true life encounters I experienced as a child and later teen exorcist and miracle worker. As a tongue-talking, spirit-slaying, word and faith child minister, I personally performed well over 75 exorcisms before the age of 18. Many of these stories are horrific in nature, many hilarious, but all are embarrassing. This podcast is for adults only, as these stories are disturbing, and I do like to say the word fuck a lot. Hey everybody, thank you for tuning in for another episode of Spiritual PTSD. Just a quick note, I'm recording this after I recorded the podcast you're about to listen to. In this episode, I do talk about a few things that some people would find somewhat harmful or insulting or hurtful. I use the term retarded and mentally retarded multiple times, and I just want to say, not because I'm afraid of negative comments or people not listening to my podcast. I welcome, if you're not interested, just don't listen. But from my heart, I don't want anybody thinking that I am making light of a group of people that I deeply love, which are those that suffer with different mental challenges, disorders, MR, mentally retarded, and so forth. So please hear out the entire podcast if you want to understand really where I'm coming from when I'm using that term. Thank you. It's 1988. I'm starting 8th grade, and man, I'm having a really hard time. 7th grade, I started failing classes. I got my first F somewhere around the middle of 7th grade, and from that point forward, I started hitting Fs in every 6 weeks. Just to kind of give you an idea, 1988, man, I mean, my head was such in the clouds at this point. I was already horny as hell. I was already a young teenage boy. I'm 13 years old. I'm in insanity. Who Framed Roger Rabbit was out. I'm trying to remember. I think It Takes Two. It takes two to make a thing go. That was like the big song, man, when this particular thing took place. I was in 8th grade at Ford Middle School. I have great memories from this time period. I mean, this was also the year when Jimmy Swaggart got busted with the hooker and cried on TV and all that. And, culturally, it was, TV shows like Alf and stuff like Perfect Strangers. I mean, it was kind of, for me, the end of, everyone pretending like things were a certain way America was. Shows like Roseanne was already starting to kind of chip away and change that. We were starting to realize, the whole home comedies were kind of bullshit, We were coming out, there were still the Cosbys and that kind of stuff, ironically. So I start 8th grade. We're still doing really bad financially. So, I'm getting older. I'm still wearing, shit clothes and, dealing with those kind of things. And I get called down, and some of this I don't really remember, but to the best of my ability, I will tell this. There's just whole chunks that I don't remember. And I do have the school documents that I've gone back and looked at. And I do want to make a point that a big claim that I'm going to make, this is a disclaimer, a big claim that I'm going to make in this podcast, I later found out was not necessarily true, but I don't want to really go into that right now because then you won't understand the impact. So just stick with me. So I was brought downstairs, not downstairs, I was brought into the, the gym, and in the back of the gym there was a couple little offices, and I went in there and sat down. And they told me that they were running tests with kids, and I did 2 half days, a little more than half days of testing, and it was everything from block tests to, sound, hand, eye, it was all kinds of stuff. And I don't remember my parents knowing about it. I don't remember anyone telling me about it. That was part of the ongoing issues I had in school, is I never knew what the fuck we were doing. I was constantly being startled, surprised, caught off guard, confused. Where are we next? I had a really, really, really hard time with understanding what was going on when I was in school. So, we do these tests, and then they call my parents in several weeks later. And, my parents weren't real active in school. There wasn't a lot of volunteering or any of that kind of stuff. Education was so de-emphasized. It was really just something that you're trying to get through. And for me, it certainly was. It was just something, it was a formality I needed to get through so I could get into full-time ministry, And plus, there's a lot of hurting people in school, and you have a chance to reach those people. So they call my parents in, and they begin telling my parents that they ran all these tests, and I want to say, I'm sure someone will correct me, these were called NARD meetings, N-A-R-D, NARD, which to me, as a kid, that's what I was called, getting kicked in the balls. I got kicked in my nards, so I thought it was absolutely hilarious. But it was a serious deal. I mean, the principal was in there. There was like 3 or 4 people in there. And in short, I remember they met with my parents first, and they brought me in, and they explained it all, that basically I had several severe learning disabilities, and that they were going to start putting me in some tutoring, some special ed classes. Great. Awesome. I don't remember what the learning disabilities were. I know now because I have the documents and stuff. But a couple of weeks later, they send a thing to all my teachers, and all the teachers know that now they are to dismiss me from the classroom after they do a certain amount of teaching, or however it was set up, which, by the way, already kind of starts adding to weirdness and shame to dismiss a kid that needs to go to a special class. But it is what it is, or was. As things progressed over a couple of months, I started noticing that I was being asked to just spend more and more time in the, in the special class. And I finished 8th grade. I was also playing football. 7th grade was god-awful. That was actually part of the way that we started figuring out there was something wrong with me, was from a coach. Coach Bennett made me come in, and every time we would get in a huddle and they'd call the play, Blue 42, I was tight end. I was a wide receiver, tight end. I would play all these different roles. I could never figure out where to line up when we would turn around. And that was actually part of how we found out that I was so severely dyslexic. After lots and lots of, again, humiliating, horrible experiences as a kid. So 9th grade year, you're going to high school. Holy shit, the whole summer, you're nervous. You're, oh my God, all these things, you're excited, you're nervous. The girls, the guys, though, they're going to, oh shit, blah, blah, blah. You go to school, I sign up for football. I was pretty awful at it. And in 8th grade, I started getting kind of good at it. Like all of a sudden I started understanding, and they moved me up into A team, and then I was at special teams, and then I broke my ankle stepping in a water irrigation hole in our practice field that they had not filled in. So the end of my professional football career, I'm sure that was the only thing that would have kept me from it. And so then, I'm a freshman. They put me in PE, and they put me in this special class. So I would go to this class, and it was confusing because I had a schedule with all of my regular teachers and what hall, and history here and health here or whatever. But then I was told to just start going to this one room. It was a big, big room. And I'd go to this one room, and I would just get all of my assignments in there. And I would go to this room, and on one side of the room, there was a few people kind of like me. We struggled with reading. We struggled with math. Math was always really difficult for me because I see things really weird. Excuse me. But at the other end of the room, there were kids with helmets, and kids in wheelchairs, and kids on crutches, and kids with Down syndrome, and kids that were MR, clinically mentally retarded, and kids that were spitting and couldn't control themselves, and they had diapers, and they would shit themselves, and kids that would like start jerking off in class. Like the full, really mentally challenged individuals. I'm intentionally staying away from the right label or whatever, and I'll get to that here in a minute. Remember, it's 1988, so the word retarded was the medical term, and the word retard was perfectly acceptable way of talking to your best friend. Very different times. So, ninth grade is progressing. This is before I had really started a Bible study or anything. This is still in my really scared of everybody, we're poor, embarrassed all the time kind of a phase. This is kind of before I started learning how to fight back, in a sense. And throughout my ninth grade year, I also started being told, well, you don't even need to leave the room in between classes because you're just coming here. So then I would hang out there, and 3 class periods would pass and I wouldn't leave. And the next thing, I was helping with some of the disabled kids, and they would be doing things like counting coins from the Coke machine, and they would get grades for that, which is fine. I mean, that's awesome. There's nothing wrong with that. They started, and I kind of formed a bond with these teachers, and then I was good with these kids, and they'd spit on me or whatever, but because of the way I was raised, everything's about compassion and service and kindness and showing God's love and all that. And so I was also constantly trying to cast demons out of these people because I had been raised to believe that was the problem, that mentally retarded kids, a lot of them it was just demonic, and you could fix that. So, which you might have already heard, I've done a podcast already on trying to cast a demon out of a mentally handicapped individual at Six Flags. So as the year went on, I was taking on more and more responsibility with these other kids, and I'm obviously not qualified. I'm just like a kid volunteer. That's very common. Then summertime, then my sophomore year, that was it. I was in that class, and I could go and come in between classes. I could do whatever I wanted, but when I had one of my next follow-up meetings, I left that out. I mean, we had these NARD meetings like every 9 weeks or something like that. I remember what it was. And it was always the same thing. These sweet ladies would be like, Damien is the sweetest, most respectful helper that, and I'm in 8th grade. They're talking like I'm like a little kid. They're like, but he just does not get the basics of, like, I mean, I would fail pre-algebra over and over and over because I kept seeing everything. We say backwards. It's not actually backwards, but that's an easy way to picture it. It's really hard to figure that shit out when those symbols are not in the right order, or you're not seeing them in the right order, or you don't understand them in the right order, or all of the above. So, when I was in 10th grade, one of the very first meetings, now the different teachers that I'm meeting with, they're starting to change, and the caseworkers and all that's changing over time. And I was basically being told that my first diagnosis was wrong, that I was much more severe than they realized, and that honestly I was borderline mentally retarded. And I remember sitting in the room with the caseworker, I believe it was the vice principal that day, my mom and my dad, and one other lady that was one of the actual teachers in the special education room. And I remember them using the term mentally retarded while they were talking about me. And it's, first of all, it's perfectly fine for you to be laughing at this because it's hilarious and you need to laugh at it or it gets too uncomfortable. But I honestly heard and believed that what they were saying was the reason I was staying in that class so much was because they had gotten the first diagnosis wrong and they wanted to retest me because they thought I was what we today would say on the spectrum of sorts, or that I was lightly MR. And I remember my dad's face just looking at him like, I honestly don't think my dad either heard them or believed them. I really don't think he heard them. Because they didn't say anything. And then the caseworker was like, so, and they didn't call him a caseworker, I forget her name, even the title, but they were like, so we're going to test him again. So A few weeks later, they test me again, and then we had another meeting, and they're like, yes, it's much more severe than we thought. It's always going to be extremely difficult for Damien to have a job, hold a job, but he is so good and he is so socially adept. We want him to work with the other kids, and if he'll do that, he can get school credit and he can graduate. So right around the same time, the summertime between my 9th grade and my 10th grade year was when I would tell everybody that I felt like I was actually called to start a Bible study. So at the same time, 10th grade, first day of school, a pretty radical Christian buddy of mine named Stefan and we start getting together and having Bible studies and start praying together in the library on every morning before school. I mean, we're the guys that carried our Bibles, the whole nine. And people started adding to that and started joining it. And then we needed a classroom. And then we needed a sponsor. So we had a teacher that let her use her classroom. And then it started growing and growing. Well, at the same time was when this conversation was happening. And it was basically, we really don't think Damien's going to get this shit. He's already working with these kids. He's already in here. He's already good with them. They love him. He can get the grades that he needs so that he can graduate if you guys will just sign and allow him to be in these classes. And we signed it. We didn't even it as I remember it, there was no consideration. I am sure that my mom in particular, I'm sure my mom and dad, but specifically my mom, I'm sure she prayed about it. I'm sure she thought about it. I'm sure she did any litany of things. But I just remember just signing because what I was told was, look, you don't have to do all the bullshit. You get to minister to these kids. And while you're pushing them in their wheelchair to go get the change from the Coke machine and then pushing them back and then sitting there with them and putting their stack of quarters in wrappers, you're getting a grade too. So let's do it. And from that point forward, I had some classes, so I had friends that would see me in regular classes. I could choose to go in those classes or not. And what I'm going to tell you, I understand it's on me for sure. But I've never known a 13-year-old that won't meet the lowest standard that you present to them. Ever. I don't really know many adults that don't just take the lowest standard that's presented to them. Much less those that are being told, and this is the next part, that this was really God's involvement. This was really God getting me in a situation to where, one, I don't have to worry with all this pesky, crazy education, memorization, secular bullshit, that I can now focus and I have favor. This was favor of God. Like when I would talk to my parents about it, my dad in particular would have like this, we call it the Skinner laugh. I can't even begin to do it on purpose or it's weird. But it's a genuine laugh when we feel like we duped someone or we tricked someone or we pranked someone, and we love our pranks. And my dad was always like, I can't believe it, man. Like, how amazing is that you don't even have to do this stuff. You get to minister to these kids all day, and then you're going to get a high school degree. And we really saw it as like God's providence. God interacting. And to make matters worse, right at that same time, we started hitting like serious growth in the Bible study. So kids, you've probably heard from other podcasts, kids from other schools started coming to our school, and it caused a problem. They would come in on Tuesday morning, and school and the principals, and this is before school shootings and all that crazy shit, but it was still not allowed. So then it grew faster and faster. We had to start meeting out in parking lots. Well, you can't meet in the parking lot. Well, then we had to find a place to meet. So we started meeting at my parents' church on Thursday night. And this thing grew and grew. And then we started putting Bible studies in all the local schools. All of that happened almost perfectly synced with the time that somebody had me sign off on saying that I'm basically retarded. And I said in the beginning of this podcast that I wanted to be specifically clear. Nobody in the Allen ISD school district at all, I don't believe, ever said that I was retarded. I don't believe anyone, looking back on it, going back, looking over, I have all the pink, which this is how long ago it was. There was the white document with the yellow and then the pink under it, and the parents got the pink one. And I found all of those, and I went over it, and I've looked at my report cards. I should post some of my report cards so people can see how bad they are. I don't believe anybody ever told me I was retarded. I believe that I authentically connected some dots. I believe that they didn't understand what was going on with me. I mean, this is 1988. We've come a long, long way with learning disabilities and how we handle kids with them. My oldest daughter is dyslexic. She got a little bit of tutoring and a little bit of help from them, and man, it barely affects her at all. And then they give special accommodations where she can chew gum and all these different things that really do actually help her focus. And it's awesome. And I've learned from that, and I'm a grown man, chewing gum and listening to music while I'm doing certain tasks. That wasn't really known, I guess, at the time. And I ended up, and I'm jumping major tracks here because the point of this podcast is about the time that I was really misdiagnosed. Not only was I misdiagnosed from a medical sense, but I personally misdiagnosed myself. And the misdiagnosis was not that I thought I was retarded, which I did for a very, very, very long time, and had unbelievable damaging results. But the real misdiagnosis was that I thought that I was chosen and that God had found a way for me not to have to mess with the boring day-to-day shit. And that is a mindset that ran rampant in my childhood. It carried over to things like taxes, paying people back, finishing jobs, being on time, like these practical things that anybody else, and in a lot of Christian denominations, they call that character. But for me, growing up the way that I did, in a very specific, weird combination of poverty, satanic panic, extreme faith, radical, crazy shit, I accepted a diagnosis that God thought I was the only one that could do something, I guess. That I was so called, that I was so anointed, like my parents had always told me, that I was now just exempt from having to learn. And that my life was never going to require that. Not because we have calculators and computers or whatever, but because I was literally never going to be required to live a normal life. I wasn't normal. I was on this planet to do God's work. I had no intentions of ever filing taxes. I would just pay someone to file my taxes. I had no intention of ever having to do anything other than whatever God was having me do, whoever I was going to help, whatever demons I was going to remove from this planet. So yeah, I actually did graduate. I graduated in 1994 from Allen High School. It's been a while, so it's a little hard for me to remember. I was either one of 2 or 4 kids in the state of Texas that was TOS exempt, specifically math TOS exempt. I didn't even take it. I didn't even have to take the exit exam. It was just like straight up, ta-da, you're done. You helped enough mentally disabled kids count coins and play with felt history characters, and you spent a lot of your time helping, with the mental health and spiritual health of the kids. Here's your high school diploma. And that was that. And it wasn't until I was, a much older adult that I realized that once I left the church, I had nothing. Nothing. I had no work skills. I had no concept of how our economy works. I didn't know how to get a job. I didn't understand things that people my age were already understanding to be really basic common sense stuff. And I struggled deeply with this idea, and I really did. A lot of people that'll hear this could tell you and make a comment. If you hear this, you're a friend of mine, then you remember, please make a comment and tell the story. I would tell people, hey, look, this is kind of strange, but I was actually diagnosed retarded. And while you're making fun of me because I don't understand something, it's actually because I'm fucking retarded, dude. And people will be like, what the forget the contradictions. There's a million of them. That I started and was able to grow a ministry to hundreds and all this kind of stuff. You know, and then as I got older, I thought, well, no, I'm not retarded. Guess what? I'm a piece of shit. No, good news, not retarded. Bad news, massive piece of shit, because you've just been lazy. See, I started turning on myself as I got older. And then I was convinced that I had been lying about being retarded. And see, it's a mental sickness. A lot of people listening to this don't even have these kind of weird inner arguments with themselves. But I was always slipping in and out of reality. And that's why I always have to say the stories I'm telling you, it's what I experienced. I swear before any God, it's the experience that I had. But I would pop in and out of reality so much to the point where I would start telling people, like, dude, I feel like I've been gone for the last 2 weeks and I'm here and I'm pretty sure it's going to happen again. What did I miss? What's happening with so-and-so? What's going on? I will still do that a little bit to this day. And all of that is trauma-based. So yeah, there was a misdiagnosis. The misdiagnosis wasn't the state or the school misdiagnosing me and saying I was retarded, which I have lived by up until like maybe 2 years ago. And I'm 44. And even when I talked to my parents about it, they remembered it as me basically being diagnosed as like lightly retarded, which I know is not a thing. And guys, I'm not making fun of people that are mentally retarded. I've lived a lifetime serving those people. That's not my point. That's not my heart. Don't waste your time. I love what my life has become, but believing that you are mentally retarded while you are going around doing other things that other people can't even imagine doing, speaking in front of, hundreds and hundreds of adults at 15, 16 years old, speaking at school rallies in front of all of your friends or at other schools of kids your own age, and I mean, just, it was such a bizarre opposite world that anybody would have said, this kid is not mentally retarded. This kid needs someone to teach him a few skills, is really all it is. But because of the radical nature, which is always at the heart of these stories, because of the radical environment and nature that I lived in, it was immediately processed as God taking care of me, and allow it and just be okay with it because this is what God is doing for you. And that's a danger that people don't understand when you raise your kids so heavy to where everything is on God, everything is on the will of God, everything is the heart of God. What does he want? What do you want with me? What do I do? What do I do? What do I wear? What do I say? Where? You're traumatizing your children. You're turning them into incapable, poorly adjusted humans that spend the rest of their lives feeling like they're, can I say, retarded? Feeling like they don't belong, feeling like they don't understand the most basic of elements. And so they spend the rest of their life always trying to fill in those gaps, always having to deal with being teased about things that should be obvious, blah, 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 blah. And it really came down to the minute somebody offered a low standard, we took it. And I want to close with this. I realize that this is going to be inflammatory for some, but if it pisses you off, I'd really ask you to just think about this for a second. The majority of people in my life and my experience that are in the radical forms of Christianity, the charismatic, tongue-talking, Pentecostal, it's God no matter what, it's, the evangelicals for fucking sure, they are the ones that tend to take the lowest standard that's offered to them. And I've always found that fascinating as one who was taught to do that, as one who did it on something really fundamental to life, like your education and your perspective of your ability to learn, or that you're not mentally retarded. I have found over and over that evangelicals, obviously not all of them, but a great deal of them, because they don't know how to engage their life, because they are so dependent on systems and God's word and God's idea, and God's ways aren't our ways, and you can't explain anything, you can't track anything. It's the Holy Spirit. It's all of this movement. There's no accountability, and I don't mean that as in leadership accountability. Give me a break. I mean that as in realizing that you aren't this broken down, fallen piece of shit imp that can't figure out what you want to do. You've been trained to be that way, but that's not what you are. I mean, clearly. And what's funny is if you look at it actually scripturally, if you look at the scripture, the Christian tradition, and previously the Judeo-Christian, any faith that teaches that you are born fucked up, you are born fallen, seems to develop a lot of people, not all of them, but a lot of people that just take the lowest standard that's offered to them because they're being told that it's God offering it to them and that God's ways aren't our ways. And you know what? Actually, what needs to happen is you need to know that this is any Christian that's listening to this is your scripture. This is your Bible. This is what you claim yourself to be. If you've got a fish on your car, this is your scripture. I didn't sign you up for it. I didn't ask you to be vocal about it. I sure as hell didn't ask you to judge and try to run an entire country by it. It's your law. And that whole book begins by talking about how we were created in the image of God. And then we hear throughout the entire Bible, any of the books in the Bible, you constantly are hearing about the kingdom of heaven is within you, and about all these things, and you will do greater things. You do the things I've done, and even greater things than these, Jesus said, who rose from the dead according to your belief system. So, in reality, God did not design you to be this broken, confused, bewildered lamb that's just like limping and leaning and you can't. That's not what the image of God is. The image of God is creation in its essence. You are to be creating your life. You're not supposed to be waiting for Jesus to create your life. You're supposed to be creating your life for yourself. And then you find all of God's universe and everything moving around you, and you start getting that where it seems like the ground comes up under your feet to meet you. When you start moving where you believe, and you're not just sitting there waiting for somebody to make these decisions for you. And it's those people heavily on the poorer side of Christianity, they're the ones that anything that's offered to them, the lowest common denominator, the lowest standard, they snap it up immediately. Because it's God, and it's relief. It's instantaneous relief. It's poverty mentality that's being manipulated through this ideology. And you can call it whatever you want. We can debate the positives, the pros, the cons, but at the end of the day, this was my experience. It's what I saw. It's embarrassing to tell this story. Like, I actually thought I would tell this story in a much funnier way, but as I start talking about it, I'm managing getting pissed and embarrassed at the same time. When I tell people this, they just look at me like, are you fucking serious? Like, gross. It's a funny thing about people. People associate stories to the person giving the story. So even if you were a victim or you were traumatized or you had nothing to do with it, after a certain point, people start looking at you like, dude, what the fuck? Like, you come from some weird fucking people, and I've lived with that my whole life. So I'm not telling this in a coy, funny way. This is one of the episodes that I kind of like, I'm not sure I should even get into this, but the God's honest truth is that it was easier for me to believe I was retarded, and it was easier for me to believe that I was retarded for God. It was easier for me to believe that God wanted me to be misdiagnosed and misunderstood as retarded so that I could do God's will. That's what people need to understand. And I'm telling you, people, I know I grew up in some radical shit, but there are millions of people that are making all of their life decisions based off of two things: God's will and whatever that lowest, most basic standard that they can meet of God's will. And I got to tell you something. For those of you of those kind of Christians I'm talking about, largely on the evangelical side, I know you don't like to read the red letters in the Bible very much. I know that causes you a lot of pain, but they're red for a reason, and it's because your namesake, the Jesus Christ, where you get the name Christian from, Christ, Christian, follower of Christ, he spoke in red, and nothing that he said or nothing that he did was the bare essentials. It wasn't the bare minimum. It was the maximum, even to the point of giving his life. And this is where we have drifted so far from the heart of the gospel that it's not gospel. The news that you are sharing is death. It is disease. It is traumatizing at best. The real gospel was called good news because it immobilized, it stopped people from being immobilized. It got them moving. It got them believing. It got them full of hope. And if you want to believe that it's because of the blood of Jesus and sin and all that, that's fine, as long as you're using it for the reasons it was intended, which a vast majority aren't. And so this sick kind of twisted shit is what's in so many Christians' psychology of, I'm chosen, I'm different, it's not a big deal, I don't have to do things like other people do, mixed with, just sit on your ass and people are going to give you cars and God's going to bring you things. And then when you're broken and you're poor and you can't even lift your own fucking ass to do anything, it's, I don't understand. I have prayed. I have taken communion. I mean, have you seen my Bible? Have you seen how many notes I have in my Bible? I don't understand. That's a culture. It's a culture of Christianity. And I grew up in country white churches, and I grew up in inner city black churches, and I grew up in some inner city Hispanic Latin street churches, and I grew up in a few bougie white people churches, and it's in all of them. It's in all of them. Not with every Christian, but it's in every form of Christianity. And it really is a very subtle manipulation of your environment to make your life easier so you don't have to deal with shit that you don't want to deal with, to justify laziness, or it was just done to you and you never even knew how fucked up it was until you're 44 years old sitting recording a podcast and you sound like an idiot. Love this episode of Spiritual PTSD Podcast? Head over to iTunes, Spotify, or Google to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It's really helpful this early on in our podcast journey. And of course, don't forget to check out our website, spiritualptsd.com, for full interviews, event updates, and to join the conversation. Thank you. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and their guest. All facts and information has been stated as the host and their guest experience them and should not serve as a historical portrayal.